book of Genesis, I've already indicated, will be sort of our literary focus, out of which our biblical theological analysis will then develop. And so I think it's useful then to start with a little survey of the contents of the book of Genesis, at least in the form of that outline that I gave you. Now what's going to happen, we'll do this and cover it hopefully today. And then before we get into Kingdom Prologue, which is our analysis of the development of the kingdom from the beginning on in terms of the several covenants, and that's what the course is all about. But before we get into that, there's this other whole area which looms so large in importance and debate and ecclesiastical turmoil these days. The whole issue of the Bible and science, as that comes into focus in issues that emerged early on in the early chapters of Genesis. So there's this whole cluster of problems that we have to think through. And starting with the chronology of the creation period and the whole question of the historicity of the early chapters of Genesis, for that matter. And then the subject of the flood, the extent, but also the question of the antiquity of man, the whole business of early earth and recent man. These issues are there. You're aware of them. And so the first segment of the course will be devoted to head-on dealing with these particular issues. And the first, I'll start with the question of the antiquity of man, which becomes exegetically a question of the meaning of the genealogies in Genesis 5, which traces things from Adam to Noah, and Genesis 11, which traces things then on from the days of Noah to Abraham. So what is the character of those genealogies, and what does that tell us or does not tell us relevant to the question of the antiquity of man? And so that will be our first issue. And I will broaden that out then to the question of the historicity of the narratives in Genesis 1 through 11 as a whole, and then come back to Genesis 1 and the thorny business of the creation chronology data and what we are to make of that in terms of the insistence of some disturbers of the church that we must all hold to literal days and to be orthodox. I give my hand away there. We'll deal with that subject then third. So there'll be that whole cluster of things that we deal with, and then we'll move back into Kingdom Prologue and into the covenantal analysis of things, which is where my heart is, and which I hope that you will see the importance of, and something that should be shaping all of your thinking and all of your ministry. But let's then start with this outline. I'll have, apart from the three folks that didn't get one, there are no extra copies now floating around anyone. Anyone want to borrow this one? Let's see if I have any other. Here's the next one. Someone else need one? A little wrinkle around the edges, sorry. As we work through this structure, it's of interest. Just hello there, let's go up and everybody see enough to. Okay, I think this is enough natural. Light, maybe if the blinds could be just moved at one point a little bit, a little more light. In Old Testament studies, in the last yes, you are. That's what we like. In the last couple of decades, especially in Old Testament studies, much attention to questions of literary artistry and the shaping of the biblical books. And this is fascinating and it's important. So we're interested in the narrative style and the literary structure of a thing, right? And what it shows about the skills of the literary skills of the authors in producing it. But we're especially interested in working out the literary structure of things because the literary structure is a window on the message. And I hope that we'll be seeing that, and that's one thing that's going on here. And in fact, the whole central thrust, I think, of the message of the book of Genesis will emerge as we just work through this outline that's before you. And then something else I admit that I'm trying to do as we work through this structure is to sensitize you to some of the techniques and traits of the historiographical technique of the biblical author, whom I say is Moses here. And when we come to study Genesis 5 and 11, that issue of what are these genealogies, are they complete or incomplete? And when we come to study the nature of the days in the Genesis 1 portrayal of the creation as tree, it will be helpful to us if we have been sensitized to the way in which Moses and other ancient writers did work. Their interest in conventional numbers and symmetrical patterns and the technique, especially of thematic arrangement that's over against chronological sequence. These are the features that might strike you as you would surprise you. You wouldn't be looking for them. You'd be opposed to the idea that they're there, and yet we can't avoid that they are there. They are present. They are right on the surface of the outline that handed you all of these features. And once we come to recognize that, then we are prepared to recognize in some of these other disputed places as well. And so that's something else that I hope will be going on as we proceed. Well, then look at your outline. The book of Genesis begins with what we may call the creation prologue. Or here, I call it the covenant of creation. And then it is followed by 10 sections, each with a superscription. Traditionally translated something like these are the generations of so-and-so. So it begins then with the creation prologue, account of the covenant of creation. So at the same time as I'm outlining the literary structure, I'm also trying to bring out something about the flow of the covenants as well. And here is the original arrangement, but then the very process of creating the world is a covenant producing process. The world is not created as a non-covenantal something, and then afterwards the covenant is imposed on it. The creation itself produces a covenanted kingdom of God. And so the covenant of creation is what is being produced, as well as the cosmos at this point. And it's in the form of a sabbatical history. And so here is the shape of the past. Here are the beginnings. Here is the origin of the cosmos. But the shape of the past is also the shape of the future. And so here is the pattern of eschatology right from the beginning, the sabbatical pattern. It confronts us right from the outset. The sabbatical structure of God's own creative activity is the scheme of history that is going to be followed as history proceeds from creation to the more ordained consummation. The whole idea of the ultimate consummation is exceedingly important, much neglected, but right from the outset, this has been the structure of creation history, that it is leading to Sabbath. Sabbath is consummation. And so in the opening chapter already, this opening prologue, we not only have an account of origins, but we have, as I said, the shape of things to come. What was the shape of God's creative activity? It involved a series of works that he performed. And then these works were subjected to judgment. In this case, God's own judgment. Day by day, the sovereign architect of the cosmos surveyed the work of his hands and pronounced judgment himself. It was not some higher one that judged his works, but the Lord himself that judged them. So the whole recurring motif of God saw that is good. That's judicial terminology. That's the judicial process where God looks from his heavenly throne and he sees and he renders verdicts. So in this case, from that upper register where he dwells after the creation of his angels enthroned there, he surveys the ongoing work of his hands and subjects it to judgment and declares it is good, it is good, it is good, and climactically, comprehensively, when it is all done, it is all very good. And so the shape of history is to perform these works, to pronounce judgment on them, and if the judgment is that it is good, then to receive the reward. And the reward is consummation, it is Sabbath, it is the ultimate heavenly reality. In the design and wisdom of God, consummation is something that has to be earned, it has to be merited, it is a reward for works accomplished. And in a sense, that is what it is from the beginning. It was inevitable that human history then would be one in which mankind too, being made in the image of God and set on the road to this same Sabbath consummation at which God had himself already arrived. It was inevitable, and that man's journey there should be dependent on that same principle, that he must accomplish the meritorious works that then God would subject to judgment, and if they can be declared good, then man will have by his works gone through his 6 days of history and entered in as his reward into the consummation of things. That is the pattern of the original covenant of creation that God makes with man himself. And heaven is always the reward for good works, and that's why it is so astounding to me as being such a fundamental thing that we find disputed in even Reformed circles, the idea of merit and reward and works as a basis for the heavenly reward. It's absolutely basic and fundamental in the structure of things, because this was the way of the Lord from the beginning. Well, there's all of that, and I'm anticipating things that we will be dealing with at great length as the course goes on. The whole nature of covenants, covenants of works and covenants of grace and all of that, right from the beginning into the principle of heaven as a reward for works accomplished, meritorious works, is embedded in the reality of God and his creation. All right, that's the prologue. Now, from that point on, as I said, the rest of the book of Genesis divides itself for us formally by this tenfold repeated formula, Ela Toledot. And, well, I said we wouldn't be getting into kingdom prologue until later, but actually this particular topic of this structure is there. So if you happen to have your kingdom prologues with you, it might be useful. Would be useful. To turn to that discussion, we can follow it fairly closely, I guess, page 6. All right, our contention, by the way, can people in the back rows hear me? There's a problem. Please let me know if you have any time you can't hear me. And let me tell you, I can't hear you. Unless you talk quite loud, this aging professor will have a problem hearing you on the front row. So have mercy on me and don't make me have to act as if make believe I hear you when I don't. Which was my problem with you earlier on when you were talking about the availability of the room. But okay, but if I'm not talking loud enough, I think I can remedy that. Page 6 then. Our contention then is that this formula, these are the generations of this is the history of the story of various modern translations of the formula, is a superscription. It is a heading for the section that follows. And now we will be noticing that understanding of it is challenged by another group, which understands that this formula where it appears refers not to what follows but to what precedes. It's not a superscription, but it's a colophon, it's a subscript which refers back to the preceding material. Now that is a question then that we are involved with at this particular point. So page 6, let's see what's going on. Beyond the prologue, Genesis 1:1 to 2:3, Genesis is divided. We just get into these 10 sections. The verse is indicated. I say that it occurs 10 times. Actually, it occurs 11 times, one in a very subordinate position, as you see there, in chapter 36, verse 9. But clearly, there are the 10 sections that dominate. And by the way, here's that number 10 that's going to be conspicuous. The author's desire to shape things in terms of 10 sections, and that will be important when we come to the genealogies in Genesis 5 and 11. And we're asking about are these complete or incomplete? Well, the very fact that he divides them in such a way that there are 10 names in each of this already is a literary signal to us that there are some literary conventions maybe that are going on in his mind that are controlling how much he actually includes, so that not necessarily exhaustive description, but a nice tenfold shaping of the things is more what he has in mind. But at least here it's the obvious, like 10 Commandments, they're the tenfold section. The idea of completeness seems to be involved in it, all right, of the book. Now, what follows the formula is always an account of the descendants of the person named. If it says these are the generations of X, then the meaning of that is that here is an account not of the origin of Mr. X, but here is an account of the subsequent history. Here are his descendants. It's not a question of his posterity, but of those. It isn't a question of their ancestors, but it is a question of his posterity, and not how he came into being, but it is an account of the ongoing history of the person who is named. What follows the formula is always an account of the descendants of the person named. And this record may just be in the form of a series of names. It may just be a genealogical list, as in the Genesis 5 and 11, for example. And or it may be a little more of a broader historical narrative of developments within the family line following after the person who is named. But it has to do with history subsequent to him, not with his own origins. Now then, not ancestry, not the past, but posterity and the future is in view in that term. Now that's our contention. The opposite point of view, as I said, is then that Eila Toledot formula should be construed as belonging to the material which precedes it. That preceding material is then regarded as an originally independent document for which the formula is thought to serve as a colophon. The thought then is that here we have a clue as to the scenes in the biblical narrative. Now, this approach is not the same as that documentary approach that we were talking about before, which is looking for the seams between the work of J and E and D and P within the narrative, none of whom is Moses. People that hold this view could hold to the Mosaic origin and unity of the Pentateuch, but nevertheless they think that they can detect through this formula the seams of the several documents of which Moses availed himself in the writing of the book of Genesis. So that is the thought, that there is a series of documents that was available that Moses used, and we can find the edge of one and the beginning of another through this particular formula, and specifically the formula belongs to the preceding document, the preceding section, which is conceived of as being a document. So that's the theory. Now then, I suggest that there's several quite decisive reasons for rejecting that counter-interpretation. And for one thing, it is not able to understand the role of the person who is named in any consistent way. It is unable to understand the formula, therefore, in any consistent, uniform way. Sometimes it must take the person named, Mr. X or whoever, as the principal subject of the preceding narrative. Why is he mentioned here at the end of it? Why is his name at the end of it? Well, it's suggested, if you read what's gone before, he was the principal subject. Clearly, that is sometimes not the case. And so then an alternative reason must be alleged for the presence of his name at the end of the document. And the alternative reason might be then, he is the one who was the author of that document. Or he was the one in whose archives that document was found, or something to that effect. But there's no one uniform way to explain why that person's name is affixed to this particular document. And we're still, in some cases, it's not just a matter that there are several different types of explanation offered, but none of the offered explanations really makes any sense in some cases. And so I point to several of those, but specifically then to chapter 36, verse 1, where if someone would read that for us, it would probably say these are the generations of Esau. All right, someone have a Bible there, 36:1.
Now these are the records of the generations of Esau.
Okay, thank you. So the name Esau then appears in 36:1. According to the theory we're objecting to, this is referring to the preceding narrative. Now you read the preceding narrative, that's all about the life of Jacob, not about Esau, you see. And so clearly Esau does not appear here as the principal character, actor in the preceding narrative. And of all people, why would Esau be the one who wrote the narrative about Jacob, or why would Esau be the one in whose archives was found the whole story of Jacob? It just doesn't make any sense. None of their alleged reasons really accounts for why Esau's name would be the one appended to the history of Jacob, and there are several others that are equally baffling. And then again, of course, when you come to the end of the book of Genesis, if the last appearance of that formula, which is in chapter 37, verse 2, refers to what precedes, then all of the end of the book of Genesis from 37 on is left without superscription or subscript or anything at all. So here are some of the problems. Now, another problem with this view that we're objecting to is that this particular formula, very prominent in the book of Genesis, does appear a few times elsewhere in the Bible, and including right there at the beginning of the New Testament. And this will be an important thing for us to deal with, again, when we're dealing with the genealogies in Genesis 5 and 11. And we are looking around in the Bible for analogies to genealogical material to help us understand Genesis 5 and 11. We'll be looking very much at Matthew 1 and following, which is another of the occasions where this formula appears. And in Matthew 1 following and in the other passage that I list here at the end of that first long paragraph, Numbers 3:1, Ruth 4:18, and as well as Matthew 1:1, it's very clear that that the formula does not refer to anything that's going before, but elsewhere it clearly does refer, beyond argument. It elsewhere refers to what follows, not to what precedes. And so I don't think that really this other view deserves that much attention. We give it this much attention because it is the view that you would find in Harrison, for example, among others. But R.K. Harrison, in his introduction, adopted this other point of view. So without more ado on that, we are going back to our own assertion that what this Ela Toledo formula is a superscription for what follows. And let's take our 5-minute break and then come back.
Again, please. Thank you. All right, we are dealing then with this Ela Toledo formula, which we're suggesting divides the book of Genesis after the original creation prologue into 10 parts. It serves as a superscription then for what follows. It is not a colophon attached to some supposed preceding document. And the point of the formula is, wherever it appears, that it is describing not the origin of the person name, but what you find, for example, if it says this is the book of the generations of Jacob, is not an account of Jacob's birth, but an account of the subsequent history of the man of his family. And now, the first appearance of that is in chapter 2, verse 4, which raises a certain question for us. This is an account of, these are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created. So here, instead of having the name of an individual, you have the cosmos, the heavens and the earth described. And then the text goes on to say, in the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens. And this particular verse then is on the part of those who see it as referring to what follows, often understood as identifying what follows as sort of a second account of creation. So how often you hear this, in fact, that seems to be the general way it's referred to, that we have two accounts of creation, what has gone up to this point, and then from Genesis 2:4 on, we have a second account of creation. And now those who hold the documentary hypothesis would, of course, be inclined to see two different accounts of creation, and they would play up the supposed differences between them as evidence that, in fact, we are dealing with two different documents. That would be part of that criteria, for dividing the documents that we were talking about. But even on the part of those who are not holding to this documentary dividing up of the Pentateuch, they too might say that what we have here is a second account of creation, not contradictory to the first one, but nevertheless a supplementary one, but that is the point of it. Now, in terms of what we find everywhere throughout the book, the formula describes not the origin of the thing named, but the subsequent history, and therefore, this first appearance of the formula, understood in terms of its meaning everywhere else, would not be saying that here's an account of how the heavens and the earth came into being, as though it were what followed a second creation account. No, that's not the meaning of it at all. Rather, this is an account of the heavens and the earth, is saying, now, here, once the heavens and the earth were here, here is what happened. And in particular, here is what happened to that man creature whom God created at the climax of the creation process of heaven and earth. So here is the history of the heavens and the earth in terms of the hosts of heaven and earth that God created, and especially of the man creature on the earth. So it does not label what follows as a second creation account, but as an account of the earthlings who emerged and developed within this heavens and earth that had been created. Now, what seems to make a problem for this interpretation of it is the second part of the verse, which really ought to be taken with the first part of the verse. I'm looking at an NIV here, which actually divides the second part of the verse from the first in a way, even with a paragraph break. But it should be read together. This is an account of the heavens and the earth in the day that they were created when the Lord God and so forth. Now, an account of the heavens and the earth in the day that they were created, doesn't that contradict what I was just saying? Doesn't that seem to support the idea that this is really referring to the creation, the origin of the heavens, this generations of the heaven and the earth when they were generated, when they were in the day that they were created? That might seem to be the case, and therefore it is necessary to become aware of another stylistic feature that I described then on the next page or so in Kingdom Prologue. So if what I'm about to say doesn't come through clearly, read there in Kingdom Prologue and these pages. The point is this, that in the Hebrew idiom, this kind of language, in the day that something happened, will be used. I asked the question, how can the world age extending from Adam to the Noahic flood? That's what actually follows. And in the section introduced by Genesis 2:4, carries right through chapters 2, chapters 3, and chapter 4, right up to chapter 5. And by the time you've gone through this whole first section, you find yourself up on the brink of the flood. And so the question is, how can that world age extending from Adam to the Noahic flood be identified as being in the day that God created the heaven and the earth, in the day of creation? Well, the use of this same idiom in the Leviticus passage there is illuminating. There, in Leviticus 6:20, the Lord directs that in the day that Aaron is anointed, he shall present a certain offering, which in fact was not offered during the 7-day period of the anointing consecration, but later on, and indeed as a perpetual offering thereafter. So in the day that he was anointed is used to describe the subsequent history. Whatever happened later on in that history belongs to the period in which he was anointed. A very similar idiom in Hebrew is the use of biyom in the day of with an infinitive construct. Let me give you some examples. What happened to Israel years after the Exodus will be described as happening in the day that they went out from Egypt. So their exodus from Egypt characterized a whole new period, and anything that happens within that period belongs to the day. And likewise, when they cross over the Jordan, that launches another new era, distinctive new era in their life. And so events that happen years later will be said to happen in the day that they crossed over the Jordan. Now, likewise, in the day that God created the heaven and earth is the event that launched and characterized this whole period right up to the flood. So bottom line then is where we started, that here we have a formula that divides the book of Genesis into these 10 parts, and it is a superscription, and it refers to the history following upon the person named, not to his own origins. All right. Now then, looking at that tenfold division, what we want to notice is that the tenfold arrangement is not just strung out like a string of beads in an unstructured line throughout the book, but it is constructed in terms of sets of 3, also can be analyzed in terms of 5, but like this, so that we have a couple of triads after the prologue. Genesis 1:1 to 2:3. Now we come to 2:4. We have the first of the sections then. And it extends, as we said, through chapter 4. And it covers a period of time, a whole era of history. And then we come to the second section, and heading chapter 5:1, extending through chapter 6:8, you see on your outline. And it deals with actually with a different theme. We are now running into the fact that the book is arranged according to themes, not just chronology. And we'll come back and cover that again. But there will be a second section paralleling the first, and then these leading up to a third, which is the climax of the first two. And so there's your first triad. Then history repeats itself, and the literary form of the book therefore repeats itself in 4, 5, and 6. And so we have a second triad, the sixth one being the business of the Abrahamic covenant. And then the rest of the book, you have with an overlapping pattern here. The sixth one, in a way, expands into 7, 8, 9, 10, which incidentally then divides the book into 5 pre-Abrahamic sections and 5 Abrahamic sections, but 2 triads followed then by 2 pairs. Within the treatment of this Abrahamic covenant, we have the theme of the divisions even within the covenant community between the Jacobs and the Esau, between those who are the true children of the covenant and those who are repudiated. And so given in the 6th section, the description of the Abrahamic covenant, we then encounter the theme of the dismissal of Ishmael and the election of Isaac, the dismission of Esau, and the election of Jacob. But that's the arrangement then of the tenfold thing into 2 triads, followed by 2 pairs. And so it's not just a helter-skelter thing, but it's a well-thought-out arrangement. Now let's go back and try to see the content of these things, and especially to see then how the overall arrangement is one dictated as much by changing theme as by continuing temporal narrative. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth. What happened after God created the world? What emerged within this universe that God had created, especially there on planet Earth, especially there in the history of this godlike man creature whom he had made. And here, of course, is the whole unhappy story of the breaking of the covenant of creation, the fall, the judgment of God on mankind, and the subsequent exile of man from the garden and the increase of sin within the world, within especially the context of what emerges already within this section, the emergence of the city of man, the state. And so the heading for this section is the city of man in the old world, all right? Now, the old world, and we're thinking here, as I described in Kingdom Prologue, we're thinking here of the division of the world that is reflected in Peter's analysis of things, where he is dealing with the fact that men are scoffing at the notion that there is an end to history and a final judgment and so on. And so remembering the words of the Lord, how he compared the days of the Son of Man to the days of Noah, huh? Jesus does that. Here, leading up to Noah, here are the days of Noah. Here's another pattern. Here's another indication of the shape of things to come. We said in Genesis 1 was the shape of things that to come. These chapters are the shape of things to come. These days of Noah leading up to the flood, Jesus says are the shape of the coming days of the Son of Man. Peter learned that from the Lord. And so we find Peter then describing the history of the world in terms of a world that was divided at the flood. If you were writing a history of the world, where would you make the big dividing point? Maybe you could say it's the fall, say it's the incarnation, and there would be good reasons for all this. Peter, however, says that the flood was the big dividing point, and the flood divided the world history into the world that then was, created out of the water and eventually destroyed in the water, the world that then was, and the world that now is.
And so here in this account, the world that then was, from this point on, the world that now is. And this first section then traces the history then in the world that then was, the old world. And what is the theme of that history on which the narrative concentrates? It concentrates on the activity of rebellious man as he finds himself in this world by God's own appointment, living within the appointed institution of the city, the state, as a form of government. And what does he do with that arrangement? And it becomes a place where the sin already evident in Adam and Eve and in the first generation of Cain murdering his brother and so on, simply keeps escalating right through that whole period of the world that then was, which just incidentally in terms of quantity, I would think is the bulk of human history in these three chapters. Quantitatively, from creation to flood, is the bulk of human history. And but in any case, the question of chronology aside, here is the theme of the city of man. That's the particular topic that is dealt with first, from fall to flood. And what emerges is that this lust for a name that emerges. The people in rebellion against God, exalting themselves, and so you get the theme developing that man tries to create a great name for himself over against, in defiance of the face of God. And that comes out then in connection with the theme of the city. As I said, we have the origin of what we call the state, the institution of the state, in these chapters. We'll talk of this at some length later on, but I contest the usual understanding that the institution of the state was something that comes only after the flood, because in discussions of the matter, one will often find that reference is made just to that common grace covenant that God makes with the world after the flood, in which it speaks about whoever sheds man's blood, by blood shall his blood be shed, and so on. People see the origin of the state at that late point. Well, not so. The origin of the state was in the world that then was, not just in the world that now is. And I see in Genesis 4:15 the God's charter of the city that he gives to Cain when Cain complains that the punishment that he's receiving is too much, and God gives certain assurances to him, including the idea that God swears on oath, which is the real meaning of the language there. Not that God put a mark on Cain, the Hebrew word oath there. It's not referring to some physical mark, but it's referring to God's oath commitment that he made to Cain. That as a matter of fact, the world would not be one that was full of anarchy, as Cain feared. Everyone that sees him is going to kill me, Lord. And God says, no, it's not going to be complete anarchy, but I appoint a divine imperium, a divine system of justice in the world, and so on. That this is we'll talk more about that too, that exegesis. But this is what happens in Genesis 4:15, that God institutes the state. 2 verses later, charter in hand, we're told that Cain proceeds to build the state. He builds a city. And so the institution of the state exists. The family has, of course, already existed from the beginning. The family is there, the basic institution. And this, by the way, is another thing we're very much concerned with, of course, is the functioning of these major institutions of family, church, and state relationship to each other. So the family has been there. Now the state is on the scene. And we have its history developing. And the history then in which mankind in the line of Cain, which is the line that's being traced here, you see, in this chapter, is the line of Adam to Noah via the line of Cain. And what we find in the line of Cain, these royal beings who are the founders of the city and the rulers in the city, that they are determined to devote and to dedicate this cultural reality of the state to themselves. They are hell-bent on turning human culture into the cult of man. And so that it is their own name that they are exalting, and so prompted Cain names the city after the name of his son, Enoch, and naming it after his ongoing dynasty, he virtually, of course, names it after himself. But this is the motif then of the lust for a great name that we encounter in that narrative, and it is quickly sketched, long periods of time condensed into just a few verses where you have a few names given who should be understood, I think, as the rulers, Cain's successors in the city of man, in the state which he has founded, and all kinds of, this is the area of common grace, as I've already said, where God's benefits are extended even to the unbelievers, even the line of Cain, and associated with the line of Cain, then is not just this benefit of the institution of the state with all of its unifying benefits and so on, but other cultural features are also ascribed to this line of Cain. So they are developing technology and culture. They are engaging in agriculture and domestication of animals. They are engaging in the arts and music and so on. They are engaging in industry, and so the forge and metal and so on is all mentioned. All of which, by the way, create big questions in terms of the biblical picture of the development of all of these things way back there. It's over on an archaeological disclosure of when did such developments take place. That's another story for another hour. But right here, just the biblical theological theme is that this is the bent of the city until quickly we encounter the seventh one in the line of Cain, the figure of Lamech, great tyrant in the city of man. And his son has produced the sword, evidently. He developed metallurgy and the sword and the forge, and so armed with the sword, Lamech is arrogant and proud and brutal, and so he sits there as a king over the city of man, and lifting up his own name against the face of God. But we find that then in Lamech is that he abuses all the divine gifts and institutions. God has founded the family, and one man, one woman, monogamous marriage. Cain has, Lamech has two wives, to whom he sings this boastful song. So he abuses the institution of the family. God had given Cain the institution of the state as a blessing. Cain sure was glad to get it. He was afraid of what things would be without it. And God gives him the state as a deterrent, punishment for sin. And justice, a system of law and order, an eye for an eye, a tooth for tooth, a life for life, that would be justice. Not so with Lamech. If a young man bruises me, I kill him. So I put to death, for a slight wound. This is not justice. So he is abusing all of God's institutions, the family and the state. But the worst sin of Lamech is his blasphemy of God. Because what he does as a king on the earth is to adopt what turns out to have been a very prevalent ideology of kingship in the ancient world, reflected in the Bible, is the ideology of divine kingship, where human kings identify themselves with the ideology of the place as themselves being deity and so on. Taking the name of God to themselves, what would you have? And how does Lamech do it? Lamech does it because he says that he is far more competent for vengeance, to avenge himself, than Cain would be. Because God has said to Cain that there would be God's vengeance through the judicial system, which is described as a sevenfold vengeance. And Lamech says, poof, for a sevenfold vengeance, God, I'm 70 sevenfold vengeance. So, in other words, he takes to himself the claim of God, that he is a super God, greater than Yahweh Elohim, the creator of the tradition and so on. So that's his ultimate sin, that he exalts himself as deity. He takes that name, and that's the climax of evil. That's the Antichrist stage. Here is a world history, the history of the world that then was, that led up to a final judgment, as in the days of Noah, so in the days of Christ. Peter describes it the same way. It's the whole world history from its beginnings through the increasing tension that was set up between the line of Cain and the godly line, till the time the Antichrist stage is reached. The Antichrist, who exalts himself above all that is called God and worship. And history does not go beyond the Antichrist stage, and that is the edge of God's tolerance, and when that happens, then he comes quickly in judgment. So that is the pattern of history, a long period of an encounter between the wicked and the godly, rival claims being established for the world, the world persecuting the church until it comes to the Antichrist stage, then comes the day of judgment. That's the pattern of history. The subset pattern within the larger pattern of that we spoke about of the Sabbath. And so this the story breaks off then. We treated the theme of the escalation of sin in the city of man as far as it went at that point. I'll catch that question in a moment. And if you look at your outline, that takes us through verse 24 in chapter 4, but that's not quite the end of this first section. Now, at the end of that, I call it D, transition. You see that? Godly remnant, the last two verses in this section, just before this section breaks off, you're right at, in effect, that you've come up to the flood's going to happen, but before the flood happens, we're going to backtrack in the next section, right back to the beginning here, to Adam and the line of Seth. And then come up to the flood again. But just before, as a transition, the first section tells us that, there was something else going on in the world. While the line of Cain was lusting for this great name for themselves, God had his own people in the world. And it describes, someone read that for us, verse 25 and 26.
And Adam had relations with his wife again, and she gave birth to a son, named him Seth, for she said, God has appointed me another offspring in place of Abel, for Cain killed him. And to Seth, to him also a son was born, and he called his name Enosh. Then men began to call upon the name of the Lord.
Nice, okay. Then men began to call, and in this community of faith, then men began here, godly, not to exalt their own name, but they began to call on the name of the Lord. So the two counter themes are very evident here, and that tells us that in spite of the fall, in spite of the devil's worst in the city of man, things going from bad to worse, that God's purposes have not failed. So this is the main thrust of the thing. Repeatedly, we'll be dealing with the city of man, but meanwhile, there's the city of God that is there and that persists all the way through. Yeah, there's the rejection, but there's always the election. There's always the remnant until we are going to get here to Israel, beyond Israel to Christ. And so this is the encouraging theme. This is the word of defense of the sovereign God, whose purposes do not fail. Whatever of evil is happening, yet God has those in the world who are his and who will be his forever. And they are those who call upon his name, the thought of which is that they take God's name for themselves. They surname themselves after God. They are his children. They recognize him as their father, and so that's the force of call on the name. Take someone's name for yourself. And to take someone's name as your father, it also then connotes you appeal to him, you look to that one for help. And so that they call on the name of the Lord as a confession of him as God and an appeal to him for fatherly help in the midst of the world. And so you get that transition to then the second section beginning with 5:1. Earlier on there was a question that you've already answered. Okay. Now, here's the thing. Chronologically, what happens? You're up to the flood, and now you're back to creation again in chapter 5, verse 1. And so the narrative style is not just one that pursues things along one linear chronological track, but it's one that deals with certain themes. And now you go back and you look at that same history of the world that then was through another window, from another angle, through the angle of the godly line, no longer Cain, but the line of Seth. And so we call this section then the community of faith, not the city of man, but the community of faith. And by the way, the city of man, it takes on this evil sort of connotation because it is perverted. But in the first instance, always keep in mind, as I say, this more. But the city of man, per se, is good. It is God's good provision. God institutes it. It's a proper thing. And therefore, we as believers in the world can relate to the state cooperatively, praying for it, taking part in it, and so on. But on the other hand, it does get perverted as in the line of Cain. But the saints live in the city of man too. And they live out their life, but there's something distinctive about them. While they are living in the city of man, they are doing certain things that identify them as the altar congregation, as the community of the Lord, his witness community in the midst of the earth. They are a community of faith, therefore, in the old world. And that's the theme of this subject. As I say, it's really the big theme of the book, that God's purposes are prevailing, and here are God's elect generation after generation without fail, continuing on the earth. The great dragon cannot snuff out all of the life of the faithful on the planet Earth. God preserves this witness community. Now, the story is traced primarily in terms of the list of names, line of Seth, and as we said when we discussed that problem of the antiquity of man, this will be one of the key chapters then as to how to understand this list of names, for the complete list. Of course, we have to know it is God, and therefore cannot really serve as the basis for establishing absolute chronology, since it isn't. But right now we're interested in simply the theme of what this is. This is the godly community in the earth, and they aren't there. And so they are traced. And with hardly any extra details, striking thing, there's that Enoch, the seventh in the line of Seth, over against the seventh in the line of Cain, which was Lamech, that terrible tyrant. Now the seventh in the line of Seth is this Enoch, this one who is a prophet figure who has a supernatural heavenly experiences. He walked with God. That's the force of that thing, that he had a prophetic, ecstatic experience of the heavenly reality, and of which also he, according to the book of Jude, he's warning the world of godliness, the day of judgment is coming. So this is a worshiping community. It's also a witnessing community to that, the evil city of man, of what will come upon them in the way of their development toward an antichrist climax. But then beyond Enoch, who is taken up into heaven, prophetic indication that in the end of this community there is deliverance from death and acceptance into heaven. At the end of that story, once again, that has come up to Noah and the flood, it breaks off, and there is again a transition. Just as at the end of the first section, there was a transition over to the idea of a community of faith. So now then, once again, when you've come up to the flood, chronologically you've recapitulated in terms of this new theme, and when you come up to the flood, once again, at the beginning of chapter 6, still within this second Toledot section, but at the beginning of chapter 6, we once again have a transition which picks up where it broke off over there with Lamech. And reminds us, okay, the godly were in the world, but then at last things come to a great climax of conflict between the godly line and the evil line. And this is a fascinating, difficult, much disputed passage then. The passage in Genesis 6, 1 through 4, again, all of these things that may be raising all kinds of questions in your mind. This is just an outline of the work of Genesis. We will be coming back and dealing in exegetical detail with them, but just quickly here, this is a bit that you know now about the sons of God, they're called. The B'nai Elohim, the sons of God, and who enter into marriages with what are called the daughters of men. And how to understand these marriages, and traditionally then there have been a couple of views. One is that these sons of God refer to heavenly beings, and that what we have here is someone would even regard it as a bit of raw mythology that somehow gets introduced into the Bible at this point, maybe somewhat mythologized, but in any case, what is supposed to be found here as a reference to demons, heavenly beings of some kind, who enter into some sort of relationships with earthly women, and the result of this then is some sort of a monstrous offspring. The offspring of these marriages described here in some terms, which give some difficulty, but not all that much, I don't think, that where they are described as Giborim, mighty ones, Nephilim, which elsewhere seems to refer to some sort of physical, gigantic stature and so on. In any case, here are this monstrous crossing over of the boundaries of heaven and earth, this inappropriate type of thing that produces a sort of monstrous offspring. It's a type of theme that is found here and there in mythology around the ancient world. And some see that as the meaning here. There are real problems with that, even in the form in which it is thought that these are fallen angels who take possession of the bodies of earthly men in order to engage in marriage relationships within which normally angels couldn't function, according to our Lord, who speaks of the resurrection as being something where there isn't marriage because it would be like the angels and so on. But so there are ways of solving some of those problems here, but with real difficulty. The judgment that's pronounced is a judgment upon man, not angels. And if the angels were involved, they'd have been the prime guilty parties. And so that view, I don't think, should be accepted. The view that has dominated traditional conservative church thinking on this is that the sons of God is a spiritual reference to them, that it is harkening back to the Sethites, the Sethite line. And it is saying that the members of the Sethite line were marrying daughters of the Canaanite line. That's the way in which the expression the daughters of men is really misinterpreted. The daughters of men, it's not just the Canaanite line or women in general. And then that's the usual view. And the problem on this view is the problem then of mixed marriages. The godly should marry in the Lord. They shouldn't be marrying unbelievers. And if this begins to happen on a large scale, the salt loses its saltiness and no longer can preserve the earth from corruption. And so there's a corrupting of society on a large scale due to this failure of the godly man to preserve its purity in this way. And the advantage of this view is that it pays attention to the context here, and to a certain extent. But there are some real